He stood in line at the airport with one hand holding a small backpack and the other gently wrapped around his child's fingers. The child was half asleep, leaning against his leg, eyes heavy after a long day. The man looked calm from the outside, but inside he was counting every step, every minute, every small decision. Traveling alone with a child was never easy, especially when money was tight and mistakes were not an option. The airport was loud, full of rolling suitcases, sharp announcements, and people rushing as if time itself was chasing them. He moved slowly, not because he wanted to, but because his child came first. He checked their boarding passes twice, then a third time, just to be sure. Losing them would mean trouble he could not afford. Other passengers barely noticed him. To them, he was just another tired parent trying to get through the day. His clothes were clean, but worn. His shoes had seen better years. Nothing about him suggested importance or power, and that was fine with him. He had learned long ago that being unnoticed often meant being left alone. A few steps ahead, a very different scene unfolded. A wealthy businessman arrived surrounded by quiet attention. No shouting, no drama, but people moved out of his way without being asked. His watch caught the light. His posture was straight, confident. An assistant carried his bag. Another spoke softly into a phone, arranging things that sounded expensive and urgent. This man was used to control, used to being listened to. The single dad noticed him for a moment, not out of admiration, but out of simple awareness. When you spend years watching your surroundings carefully, you notice everything. Then he looked away and focused back on his child, who had started rubbing sleepy eyes. They boarded the plane with the rest of the passengers. The single dad helped his child into the seat near the window. He placed a small backpack on his seat carefully, like it held something fragile. Inside were snacks, a book, and a worn photograph folded neatly. He sat beside the child, buckled both seatbelts, and whispered a few calming words. The plane slowly filled. Overhead bins slammed shut. Voices blended into a steady hum. The businessman took a seat several rows ahead, near the aisle, with his assistant close by. He barely glanced around. Flying was routine for him, just another part of his schedule. As the plane taxied down the runway, the single dad rested his hand on his child's shoulder. The engines roared. The child squeezed his fingers for a second, then relaxed as the plane lifted into the sky. The man let out a quiet breath he did not realize he was holding. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin settled into a calmer rhythm. Some passengers slept. Some watched movies. Some stared out the windows, lost in thought. The child leaned against the single dad's arm, breathing softly. He adjusted his posture so the child could sleep more comfortably, even though his own arm began to ache. He did not mind the discomfort. He was used to it. Life had taught him that small pain was nothing compared to the cost of carelessness. Years ago, he had made choices that shaped him into the person he was now. Choices that gave him skills he never talked about and memories he kept locked away. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. He declined politely. He did not want to wake the child. Instead, he watched the cabin quietly, his eyes moving without effort, taking in details the way he always did. A habit that never really left him. A few rows ahead, the businessman was on his laptop, fingers moving quickly. He looked focused, almost tense. From time to time, he rubbed his chest lightly, as if brushing off an itch or discomfort. His assistant leaned over to say something, but the businessman waved him off, eyes still on the screen. The single dad noticed the gesture. It was small, easy to miss. Most people would have ignored it. He did not. He had seen that movement before many times, in places far from comfort and luxury. He shifted slightly in his seat, paying closer attention. Minutes passed. The plane hummed steadily through the sky. The child stirred, then settled again. The single dad kept his voice low as he whispered reassurance, more for himself than for the child. Ahead, the businessman's movements became less controlled. He adjusted his collar. His breathing changed, shallow and uneven. His assistant finally noticed and leaned in with concern. The businessman shook his head, forcing a thin smile, trying to look fine when he clearly was not. The single dad's heart rate picked up, though his face stayed calm. He had hoped he was wrong. He never wanted to be right about things like this. He watched as the businessman pressed his fingers against his chest again, harder this time, and leaned back in his seat. A flight attendant approached, asking if everything was okay. The businessman nodded, but the lie did not sit well on his face. Sweat had begun to form along his hairline. His eyes were unfocused now, attention slipping away from the world around him. The single dad gently shifted his child, so they were more secure against the seat. He loosened his own seatbelt slightly, just in case. His mind moved through steps automatically, like a door opening into a room he had not visited in years. He remembered promises he had made to himself, to stay quiet, to stay invisible, to keep life simple for the child who depended on him for everything. He did not want trouble, did not want attention, but he also remembered something else, a rule he had never broken, no matter the cost. When someone's life is slipping away, you do not look the other way. The businessman suddenly slumped forward. The laptop slid from his tray table and hit the floor with a dull sound. His assistant shouted for help, panic breaking through his professional calm. Heads turned. Murmurs spread to the cabin like a wave. The flight attendant rushed back, calling for medical assistance. Fear filled the air. Some passengers froze. Others whispered prayers. A few pulled out their phones, unsure what else to do. The single dad stood up. He did not rush. He did not shout. He moved with quiet purpose, stepping into the aisle as if this moment had been waiting for him. He gently asked another passenger to watch his child for a moment. His voice was steady, kind, and impossible to ignore. As he walked toward the front, the noise of the cabin faded in his mind. Training, experience, instinct, all of it rose to the surface. He knelt beside the businessman, assessed him in seconds, and looked up at the flight attendant. "I can help," he said simply. In that moment, nobody asked who he was or where he came from. All that mattered was the calm in his eyes and the certainty in his voice. And high above the ground, with nowhere to land and no time to waste, the life of a powerful man now rested in the hands of someone the world had never noticed at all. The aisle felt narrower than before as people pulled their legs back to make space. The single dad knelt beside the businessman, his movement steady even as the plane trembled slightly in the air. He spoke calmly, not loudly, but with enough confidence that the panic around him began to soften. He placed 2 fingers on the businessman's neck, checking for a pulse. It was weak, uneven, but still there. The assistant hovered close, face pale, hands shaking, asking questions all at once. The single dad lifted one hand slightly, a silent request for quiet. "Give him space," he said, "and please listen." Something about his voice made people obey without thinking. The assistant stepped back. A nearby passenger closed the aisle curtain to block the growing crowd. The flight attendant crouched beside him, relief clear in her eyes. "What do you need?" she asked. "First, let's get him flat," the single dad replied. "And I need the medical kit." She nodded and rushed off. The businessman's head lolled to the side. His breathing was shallow now, each breath a struggle. Sweat soaked through his collar. The single dad loosened it gently, careful not to cause pain. He spoke to the businessman, even though there was no response. Calm words, grounding words. He had learned long ago that sometimes the body listened even when the mind could not. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Stay with me." Passengers watched in silence. The earlier whispers faded. Phones were lowered. Fear was still there, but now it was mixed with hope. The medical kit arrived. The single dad opened it quickly, hands sure, like he had done this many times before. He checked the contents, nodded once, then began working. He guided the flight attendant step by step, explained what to hand him and when. The assistant knelt on the other side now, tears in his eyes. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked. The single dad did not answer right away. He focused on the businessman, monitoring breathing, checking color, watching for signs. After a moment, he said, "We're doing what we can. Stay calm. That helps more than you think." Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. The plane continued forward, trapped between sky and ground. Somewhere near the back, a child cried softly. Somewhere else, someone prayed under their breath. The businessman suddenly gasped, his body jerking slightly. The single dad reacted instantly, adjusting his position, supporting him, keeping his airway clear. He gave clear instructions, his voice firm but never harsh. "Easy," he said. "Breathe with me." Slowly. The businessman's breathing steadied just enough to give them time. Color returned faintly to his face. It was not over, but it was something. The flight attendant spoke into the intercom, requesting medical support upon landing. Her voice shook, but she held it together. The captain's calm reply echoed back, promising a faster descent and emergency crews waiting. The single dad finally allowed himself one quick glance toward the back of the plane. He saw his child sitting quietly, watched over by a kind stranger. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The child looked worried but safe. That look tightened something in his chest. He turned back to the businessman. Focus returned. There would be time for feelings later. As they worked, the assistant began talking, almost without realizing it. He spoke about meetings, deadlines, important deals waiting on the ground. His voice cracked when he mentioned family. "He can't die," the assistant whispered. "Not now." The single dad met his eyes. "No one plans a moment like this," he said gently. "But right now he's alive. Hold on to that." Another wave of discomfort hit the businessman. The single dad stayed with him through it, adjusting, guiding, steady as a rock in moving water. Every action came from experience earned the hard way. Finally, the plane began its descent. The cabin tilted slightly. Seatbelt signs chimed. Passengers returned to their seats, watching with quiet respect. No one complained. No one rushed. The businessman was conscious now, barely, his eyes fluttering open for a second. Confusion crossed his face. The single dad leaned closer, so he could hear. "You had a medical emergency," he said softly. "You're on a plane. Help is waiting for you. Just keep breathing." The businessman tried to speak, but could not. He squeezed the single dad's wrist weakly, a silent plea. "I've got you," the single dad replied. The wheels hit the runway harder than usual. The plane slowed quickly. Applause broke out, not loud, not joyful, but relieved. Emergency crews boarded within minutes. The medical team took over, impressed by how stable the businessman was under the circumstances. They worked efficiently, placing him on a stretcher, asking quick questions. One of them turned to the single dad. "Did you do the initial care?" "Yes," he answered simply. "You did a good job," the medic said with genuine respect. The assistant grabbed the single dad's hand. "Thank you," he said, voice shaking. "You saved his life." The single dad nodded once. No smile, no pride, just relief. As the businessman was taken off the plane, passengers watched the single dad return to his seat. He checked on his child first, lifting them into a gentle hug. Only then did his shoulders relax. Around him, people whispered words of praise. Some nodded at him with admiration. A few tried to speak to him. He kept his answers short, polite, distant, because while everyone else felt the moment ending, he knew something important was just beginning, and he already felt the weight of attention pressing closer than he wanted. The plane sat still at the gate, engines quiet now, but the energy inside had not settled. Passengers remained seated longer than usual, not because they were told to, but because everyone felt the weight of what had just happened. A life had nearly been lost in the air, and somehow, against all odds, it had been pulled back. The single dad stayed in his seat, his child resting against him again. He spoke softly, telling the child everything was okay now. His hand moved slowly through the child's hair, a small habit that always brought calm to both of them. Flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking on people, thanking them for their patience. More than one of them stopped near the single dad, offering quiet words of gratitude. He nodded each time, respectful but uncomfortable with the attention. Outside the plane, flashing lights reflected against the windows. Medical teams were already moving fast across the runway. Somewhere ahead, the businessman was being transferred, surrounded by professionals who spoke in quick, practiced tones. The assistant remained on the plane for a moment, pacing near the front. His phone rang again and again. He ignored it. His eyes kept drifting back toward the single dad, as if trying to understand how someone like him had appeared at exactly the right moment. When passengers were finally allowed to leave, The aisle filled slowly. People stepped out with a different kind of silence now. Some looked at the single dad with curiosity, others with respect. A few tried to say something meaningful, but settled for a simple nod. The assistant approached as the single dad stood, lifting his child and slipping the backpack onto his shoulder. "Please," the assistant said, blocking the aisle gently. "He's awake now. He keeps asking about you." The single dad paused. "That's good," he replied. "I'm glad he's okay." "He wants to thank you," the assistant said. "He wants to meet you, just for a moment." The single dad looked down at his child, then back up. His expression was calm, but there was a firmness there too. "I don't need thanks," he said quietly. "You should stay with him." The assistant hesitated. "At least tell me your name." The single dad shook his head. "That's not important." Before the assistant could say more, the single dad stepped aside, letting others pass, then blended into the slow-moving line of passengers leaving the plane. By the time the assistant turned back after answering a call, the man and his child were gone. At the hospital, the businessman lay in a quiet room, monitors beeping softly. Color had returned to his face, though he looked smaller somehow, stripped of power and certainty. His assistant stood nearby, finally returning missed calls, explaining in short sentences that meetings would be canceled. "Where is he?" the businessman asked suddenly, his voice weak but sharp with urgency. "Who?" the assistant asked. "The man," the businessman said. "The one who saved me." The assistant hesitated. "He left." "What do you mean, he left?" "He didn't want to wait," the assistant replied. "He didn't give a name." The businessman stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, there was fear in his eyes, not of death, but of something harder to face. The idea that someone could change his fate and walk away without wanting anything in return. "He saved my life," the businessman said slowly, "and I don't even know who he is." Doctors came and went. Explanations were given. Warnings were shared. The businessman listened, but his mind was somewhere else. Over and over, he replayed the moment when darkness closed in and a calm voice pulled him back. Back at the airport, the single dad moved quickly through the terminal. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He had learned long ago how to disappear into a crowd. His child tugged at his sleeve. "Are we in trouble?" the child asked softly. "No," he replied. "Everything's fine." "But people were looking at you," the child said. He gave a small smile. "They were just scared." They exited the terminal and stepped into the cool air. He breathed deeply for the first time since the emergency. His body finally allowed the tension to release. Just a little. He checked his phone. A few missed calls from an unknown number. He turned it off. He knew exactly who was calling. At the hospital, the businessman insisted on answers. He asked staff. He asked airport officials. He asked security. No one had much to offer. The man had boarded like any other passenger, paid normally, no special requests, no records that stood out. "That's impossible," the businessman said. "Everyone leaves a trail." "Not everyone," the assistant replied quietly. The next day, news spread quietly among those who had been on the flight. A few online posts appeared, vague and respectful. No names, no clear images. Just stories of a stranger who stepped forward when no one else could. The businessman was discharged under strict instructions. As he left the hospital, he felt the world differently. The cars, the people, the noise, everything seemed louder, sharper, more fragile. He canceled meetings, shocked his staff. He returned home and sat alone longer than he had in years. That night, he dreamed of the plane, of the narrow aisle, of a calm pair of eyes looking back at him when everything else faded. The next morning, he made a decision. "Find him," he told his assistant. Quietly. "We don't have much to go on," the assistant said. "Then start with the flight." The businessman replied. "Every passenger, every detail." The search began carefully. No press, no public announcements, just questions asked behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the single dad checked into a modest place to stay. He unpacked only what was needed. He ordered simple food. He helped his child with a small puzzle they always traveled with. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Simple, quiet. But late that night, as he sat by the window watching distant lights, he felt it again, that sense that the past was not done with him, and far away. In a world of glass offices and power, a man whose life had been saved prepared to turn everything upside down to find a stranger who vanished without a word. The search began quietly, almost invisibly, just the way the businessman wanted it. He did not want the media involved. He did not want headlines or public praise. This was personal. A stranger had stepped into his worst moment and changed the ending. That was not something he could ignore. His assistant started with the passenger list from the flight. There were hundreds of names. Families, tourists, business travelers, students. Nothing stood out at first glance. The single dad had paid for a regular seat. No upgrades. No special meals. No loyalty status. Just another ticket among many. Security footage from the airport showed him walking to the terminal with his child. He carried one small backpack. No designer luggage. No signs of wealth. He moved with purpose but without hurry. When the assistant paused the video, he noticed something different. The man was always aware of his surroundings. He glanced at exits. He positioned himself near open space in waiting areas. He scanned faces without being obvious. It was not fear. It was habit. Zoom in. The businessman said softly as they watched the footage together in a private office. They saw him kneel to tie his child's shoe. They saw him hand over boarding passes. They saw him lift the sleeping child gently as they entered the plane. That's him, the businessman said, leaning back in his chair. There was no doubt in his mind. He recognized the steady way the man moved. The same calm presence from the aisle of the plane. Find out where he went after landing, the businessman said. It was harder than expected. The man had not used a credit card at the airport shops. He had not ordered a car through any major service. He left on foot with his child, blending into the crowd outside the terminal. Days passed. The businessman returned to work, but not in the same way as before. Meetings felt smaller. Arguments felt pointless. He found himself distracted, thinking about how quickly everything could have ended. He began noticing things he had ignored for years. The tired look on his driver's face, the way his assistant skipped meals, the distance between him and his own family. One evening, while reviewing another set of footage, his assistant paused the screen suddenly. There, he said. The video showed the single dad speaking to an older airport employee near an information desk. It was brief, polite, but the employee seemed to know him. The businessman made a call. The next morning, they met the employee in a quiet office at the airport. The older man looked nervous at first, unsure why someone so important wanted to speak to him. We're just looking for a passenger from that flight. The assistant explained gently. The employee nodded slowly. I remember him, he said. He travels sometimes. Always with the child. Very respectful. Do you know his name? The businessman asked. The employee hesitated. I signed him in once for a lost item, but he asked me not to keep a copy of his details after it was resolved. Said he valued privacy. Did he say why? The employee looked thoughtful. He didn't say much, but I get the feeling he's trying to stay out of certain circles. The businessman exchanged a glance with his assistant. That confirmed what they already suspected. He used to work in emergency response. The employee added suddenly, I remember because he helped a passenger once before. A small situation. He handled it like a professional. That small piece of information changed everything. Back in the office, the businessman ordered a broader search, but still quiet. Former emergency workers, medical responders, military medics, anyone matching the age and appearance from the footage. Meanwhile, the single dad kept moving. He and his child did not stay long in one place. Not because they were running, but because that had become their way of life. Temporary apartments, short-term jobs, quiet routines. He found work quickly in each new city, sometimes fixing equipment, sometimes helping in clinics, sometimes doing manual labor. He never stayed long enough for deep connections to form. At night, after his child fell asleep, he would sit by the window and think about the plane. He had known it would bring attention. He had hoped the chaos of landing would allow him to slip away unnoticed. For a moment, he thought he had succeeded. But when he turned his phone back on briefly to check messages, he saw missed calls from unknown numbers again. He turned it off once more. He was not afraid of gratitude. He was afraid of recognition. Weeks later, the businessman finally received a report. A former emergency medical technician had left his position years ago under quiet circumstances. No scandal, no public issue, just a sudden resignation after a personal loss. The file included a small photo. It was him. The businessman studied the image carefully. The man looked younger, but the same calm eyes were there. Why would someone with that training disappear like this? The assistant asked. The businessman thought for a long moment, maybe because he lost something bigger than career. The report mentioned that the man had once been praised for bravery during a roadside accident years ago. He had saved several people before help arrived. After that event, he left the field. No explanation. The businessman leaned back in his chair, feeling something shift inside him. This was not a man chasing money or fame. This was someone who had already seen enough of life's hardest moments. The businessman made another decision. Stop digging into his past, he said. The assistant looked surprised. But we're close. I don't want to drag him into something he clearly left behind, the businessman replied. Find him, yes, but do it respectfully. Instead of using pressure, the businessman chose a different path. He began funding small community clinics quietly, especially in areas where emergency care was limited. He created scholarships for single parents studying in medical fields. He improved working conditions for his own staff, something long overdue. At first, his team was confused by the sudden changes, but he did not explain much. One afternoon, weeks later, the assistant received a small piece of information from a contact in another city. A man matching the description had recently volunteered at a local community center during a minor health emergency. No payment, no recognition, just quiet help. The businessman felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. He was close, but he began to understand something important. The single dad did not disappear because he wanted to be chased. He disappeared because that was how he survived. That night, the businessman sat alone in his home office. He looked at the city lights outside the window, remembering how small the world felt when he lay helpless on that plane. He realized a stranger had given him more than his life. He had given him perspective. And maybe, just maybe, the best way to honor that gift was not to drag him back in the spotlight, but to become someone worthy of the second chance he had been given. The city woke slowly that morning, wrapped in pale light and distant noise. In a modest apartment on a quiet street, the single dad prepared breakfast while his child sat at the small table, drawing shapes on a piece of paper. The place was simple, clean, temporary, like all the others before it. He moved carefully, not wanting to rush the moment. Life had returned to a steady rhythm, and he valued that more than anything. School forms, grocery lists, small jobs that paid just enough. Quiet evenings. He believed he had closed the chapter of the flight. But life had a way of circling back. That afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. No company logo. Just his name written neatly on the front. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note. It said, "Thank you," not in grand words, not with promises or praise. Just a simple message expressing gratitude for a life saved in a moment that changed everything. At the bottom was a line that stood out. "I will not come looking for you if you do not wish to be found." The single dad sat down slowly. He read the note again, then folded it and placed it back inside the envelope. There was no signature. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Across the city, the businessman stood in his office, watching traffic move far below. He had chosen not to send gifts, money, or public recognition. He understood now that some acts of kindness were meant to remain clean, untouched by obligation. Instead, he had changed his own life. He no longer filled every hour with work. He showed up for family dinners. He listened more than he spoke. He questioned decisions that once seemed automatic. The memory of the plane stayed with him. The narrow aisle, the fear, the calm voice that guided him back. Weeks turned into months. The single dad and his child stayed in the city longer than expected. The child liked the school. The neighborhood felt safe. For the first time in a long while, The single dad allowed himself to imagine staying. One evening, while volunteering at a small community center during a free health check event, he noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near the entrance. The businessman. There were no assistants, no suit, just a man in a simple jacket, hands in his pockets, looking unsure of himself. Their eyes met. The room felt suddenly smaller. "I said I wouldn't come looking," the businessman said softly as he approached. "But I was invited here today. I didn't expect you to be here." The single dad studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "This place helps people," he said. "That's why I'm here." "So am I," the businessman replied. They stood in silence for a second, two lives crossing again in a very different way than before. "I want you to know," the businessman continued, "I didn't try to expose you or pull you back into anything you left behind." The single dad relaxed slightly. "I appreciate that," he said. "I also want you to know," the businessman added, "your choice changed more than one life." The single dad gave a small smile. "That wasn't my goal." "I know," the businessman said. "That's why it mattered." They talked briefly about ordinary things, the community center, the weather, the importance of showing up quietly when it counts. No promises were made, no deals offered. Before leaving, the businessman looked toward the room where families waited for care. "If you ever need support for this place," he said, "it will be there, no strings." The single dad nodded once. That was enough. As the businessman walked away, he felt lighter. He no longer needed closure. The encounter had given him something better. Peace. Later that night, the single dad tucked his child into bed. The child looked up at him sleepily. "Are we staying here?" the child asked. He thought for a moment. "Yes," he said gently. "I think we are." Outside, the city lights flickered on. Somewhere, a powerful man continued to live with a new sense of purpose. Somewhere else, a quiet father prepared for another ordinary day. No headlines marked what happened on that plane. No statues were built. But two lives moved forward differently because of one moment of courage. And sometimes that is how the most real stories end.